The image before us is almost unbearably serene. A schoolhouse interior, corrugated metal walls, simple wooden furnishings, an atmosphere of institutional order. The photograph appears to have been taken sometime in the early 1900s or 1910s, during what Americans were told was a time of progress, education, and reconstruction. A white female teacher stands at the center of the composition, her posture erect and assured. She is surrounded by African American children of various ages, arranged with the careful deliberation of a formal portrait. Some children stand, some sit. All are positioned with purpose. But look closer. The children's clothing tells a story that their faces attempt to conceal. The girl on the far left cannot be more than 8 years old. She wears a white apron over her dress, indicating her status as a domestic laborer. Her expression is not playful, not curious. It is composed, resigned. The boys on the far right, arranged in a row, wear jackets that show visible wear and mending. Their hands, folded carefully for the camera, display calluses and marks suggesting labor. Agricultural labor, mechanical labor, the evidence of work that childhood should never contain. At first glance, this photograph appears to be a document of progress. It presents itself as evidence that education is reaching Black children after emancipation. It purports to show civilization, institutional care, the machinery of the American state functioning to uplift formerly enslaved people. Many viewers, then and now, would look at this image and see exactly what it was designed to show: a teacher doing her duty, children receiving schooling, order. But beneath this surface narrative lies a darker reality. This photograph is not primarily a document of education. It is documentation of something far more sinister. It is evidence of apprenticeship, that is, the systematic legal re-enslavement of African American children. The teacher we see here is not an educator in the sense we understand it. She is one component of a state apparatus that has legalized the bondage of the children surrounding her. The education these children are receiving is not academic instruction. It is documentation of their legal status as bound laborers. The children themselves, with their worn clothes and weary expressions, are products of a legal machine designed with one purpose: to recapture as many Black children as possible and return them to de facto slavery while maintaining the appearance of legality. This photograph is a crime scene, but the crime was not committed with violence or force. It was committed with statutes, courtrooms, and the signature of a judge. On November 22, 1865, exactly 4 months and 2 weeks after General Robert E. Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse, effectively ending the Civil War, the Mississippi State Legislature convened. What they passed that day would be replicated across 12 southern and border states within the next 5 years. It was a statute concerning the regulation of labor relations between freed people and their former enslavers. The statute bore a bureaucratic title designed to sound neutral and administrative: an act to regulate the relation of master and apprentice as relates to freedmen, free Negroes, and mulattoes. Read in isolation, divorced from its historical context, this statute sounds almost benign. It sounds like ordinary administrative legislation. It sounds like the ordinary machinery of government functioning to establish clear rules and procedures for a transitional period. But the statute was not called the Re-Enslavement Act. It was not titled the Child Labor Seizure Act. It was called the Apprenticeship Law. And this choice of language was absolutely deliberate. It was designed to invoke a long tradition of apprenticeship in American law that stretched back to the colonial period. In that tradition, apprenticeship had been a recognized and legitimate labor arrangement, typically involving poor white children who were bound to craftsmen or merchants to learn a trade. By using this familiar and respectable language, the Mississippi legislature disguised what was actually a radically different and radically more exploitative system. They had created a legal mechanism not for education, but for enslavement. The statute authorized local sheriffs, justices of the peace, and county civil officers to identify all minor Black children in their jurisdictions and seize them for binding to white citizens. But the statute did not define minor as it had been defined for white children or European immigrants. The statute defined minor as any Black child under the age of 21 for boys and under 18 for girls. This age differential was crucial. It meant that children could be bound for periods far exceeding the terms given to white apprentices. More significantly, the statute authorized and required these officials to identify not just orphan children, but any black child whose parents were deemed unable to provide for them. The statute's language was deliberately vague on this critical point. Unable to provide did not mean impoverished in an absolute sense. It meant a parent who could not demonstrate immediate property ownership or secure employment recognized by the court. After the chaos of emancipation, with formerly enslaved people scattered, fragmented, and struggling to reconstitute their families and their economic lives, this standard was impossibly broad. A child whose mother worked as a washerwoman, one of the few occupations available to freed black women, could be deemed unable to be properly provided for. A child whose father was searching for work could be seized. A child whose family had been separated during slavery and was still searching for lost relatives could be declared an orphan, even if living parents existed somewhere in the South. The law gave county officials unlimited discretion to determine who qualified, and that discretion was uniformly exercised against black families. Once a county court identified such a child, it was required to hold an apprenticeship proceeding. But this is where the machinery of injustice becomes clearest. The child's parents were frequently not notified. No hearing was held where the family could present evidence or contest the proceeding. The probate judge would examine the petition brought by a white person seeking to apprentice the child. That petition would state that the child was in need of care or moral instruction. Often, it would not even be true that the parents were dead or absent. It would simply be asserted by a white person with standing in the courtroom, and the courts recognized the standing of any white person over that of black families. Once a probate judge signed the indenture, the legal contract binding the child to labor, that document became an enforceable legal instrument. The child was no longer free. The child could not leave. If the child attempted to escape, county sheriffs were authorized to use force to recapture them and return them to their master or mistress. Refusal to work was made a criminal offense. Children as young as 4 years old were subject to these provisions. The statute included a provision that has been largely overlooked, but is absolutely essential to understanding this system. It gave former slaveholders first opportunity to hire, a term used instead of purchase or own to maintain the pretense of legality, children who had been enslaved by them. The statute also permitted the master or mistress to inflict such moderate corporeal chastisement as they deemed necessary to enforce obedience. This was not metaphorical language. Corporal punishment, whipping, beating, physical brutalization remained legal when inflicted on apprenticed children. The statute stipulated that sheriffs and county courts were required to maintain detailed ledgers documenting the names and terms of all apprenticed children. These ledgers would be examined semi-annually to ensure compliance. The system was designed not to fail. It was designed to be comprehensive, permanent, and bureaucratically perfect. Let us move from the abstract language of statutes to the concrete reality of how this system functioned in practice. County courts became the primary institution through which this re-enslavement occurred. Probate judges, often the same individuals who had adjudicated slaveholder estates and probated the wills of slave owners before the war, now sat at the same desks, in the same courthouses, reviewing petitions from white citizens seeking to apprentice black children. Picture a probate judge's office in Christian County, Kentucky in 1866. A white planter or merchant enters, carrying a petition. The petition names a specific black child. It asserts that the child is orphaned, or that the child's parents are impoverished and unable to care for them, or that the child requires moral instruction and training in habits of industry. The petition requests that the court bind the child to the petitioner for a term of apprenticeship, typically 14 years for girls, 16 or more years for boys. The judge reviews the petition. In most cases, no investigation is conducted. No inquiry is made as to whether the child's parents are actually deceased or actually unable to provide care. No hearing is held. No evidence is presented on the child's behalf. No opportunity is given to the child's mother or father to speak before a court. In many cases, the parents are not even notified that their child is being seized through a judicial proceeding. The judge signs the indenture. The document is recorded in the county ledger. Within minutes, the child is removed from their home or community and delivered to their new master or mistress. The system was designed to be anonymous to those it victimized. A black family would suddenly discover their child missing. They would attempt to locate the child. In many cases, they had no idea that their child had been processed through a probate court. Even if they discovered the truth, they had no legal standing to challenge the proceeding. They were not permitted to testify before a court. They had no resources to hire attorneys. The law, which had been constructed to protect property rights and contractual arrangements, provided no protection for the property most precious to them, their own children. Between 1865 and 1875, approximately 50,000 African American children were apprenticed through these statutes in southern and border states. This is not a rhetorical figure. 50,000 is a number that emerges from courthouse records still extant today. It can be counted, disaggregated by state, by year, by type of labor. It represents 50,000 specific children whose names were written in ledgers, 50,000 specific families destroyed. In Kentucky alone, specifically in Christian County, there were 138 apprenticeship indentures recorded in the single year 1860s. 138 children. Think about what that means. In a single county, in a single year, following the end of slavery, 138 children were legally bound to forced labor. This was not random. This was systematic. South Carolina's records document over 8,000 apprenticeship contracts issued between 1865 and 1870. 8,000 children, their names recorded in probate court documents, legally stripped of freedom they had possessed for all of 3 to 5 years. Louisiana records indicate that in October 1865, a Freedmen's Bureau commissioner in New Orleans announced he would close 2 black orphanages in the city and allow all of the children housed there to be apprenticed to their former slaveholders. The documentation indicates that white former slaveholders began appearing at the orphanage doors, arriving to claim children they once had enslaved. But the records note something remarkable. By that point, half of the children had already run away. A newspaper account of the period documented, even the children would rather die than be bound again by any chains. These children, as young as 4 years old in some cases, understood exactly what apprenticeship meant. They understood it because they had been born into slavery or had experienced its tail end. They had seen what bondage meant, and rather than submit to re-enslavement disguised in legal language, they chose flight, chose danger, chose the unknown over the certainty of captivity. Let us focus on a single documented case to make the abstract system tangibly real. In 1866, in Christian County, Kentucky, a man named Elijah Simmons went before the probate court. Simmons had been a slaveholder before the war. His family had owned 5 enslaved people, ranging in age from 6 to 24 years old. The Civil War had ended, slavery had been abolished, and those 5 people were now legally free. But Simmons's economy had not changed. His farm still required labor, his household still required workers. And so, he did what thousands of other former slaveholders were doing. He went to court and sought to bind freed children to him through apprenticeship. The court record documents his success. 2 children were bound to him: Fanny, age 8, and Robert, age 4. Fanny was apprenticed as a housekeeper. Robert was apprenticed as a farm worker. Look at those ages. Fanny was 8 years old. Robert was 4 years old. 4 years old. An age at which most children are beginning formal education, learning to read, playing with siblings, remaining under their parents' care. Robert was instead being legally bound to 14 years of forced labor. His childhood would be spent in fields, his labor extracted without compensation, his freedom surrendered to a document signed by a judge who had never met him. Why does this matter? Because Fanny and Robert were not exceptions. They were the norm. Across Kentucky, across all former Confederate states and border states, thousands of Fannys and Roberts were being processed through probate courts at that very moment. The system was working exactly as designed. Children who had been born into slavery were now, within a few years of emancipation, being re-enslaved through legal means. And the courts were keeping meticulous records. The indentures themselves still exist. They are stored in county courthouses and historical archives. They are legal documents, properly formatted, properly notarized, bearing the signatures of judges and witnesses. Each one is evidence of a crime disguised as law. This is where we must pause to consider something that historians, legal scholars, and educators have largely failed to do. They have failed to name this system accurately. They have allowed the legal language of the statutes to obscure what was actually occurring. The statutes were called apprenticeship laws. Apprenticeship, in American legal tradition, was a recognized form of labor arrangement. But the African American apprenticeships that emerged after 1865 bore almost no resemblance to previous apprenticeship traditions. In pre-war apprenticeships involving white children or free black children in northern states, apprentices had certain legal protections. They had contracts that specified terms. They had opportunities to learn skilled trades. They could anticipate a future in which they would exit bondage and use their skills to achieve economic independence. None of these features existed for black children apprenticed under these post-1865 statutes. The apprenticeships were not designed to teach them trades that would lead to freedom and economic advancement. They were designed to extract maximum labor with minimal compensation or education. They were deliberately constructed to be permanent, or at least as permanent as circumstances allowed. They were slavery by another name, but because they wore the costume of apprenticeship, a term borrowed from legitimate labor law traditions, the system could be discussed, legislated, and defended using respectable legal language. Judges could point to the statute and say they were merely enforcing the law. Politicians could claim they were establishing orderly labor relations during a period of transition. Newspapers could report on apprenticeships being issued without noting that these were fundamentally different from previous practices. And most tellingly, this system has been largely invisible in American history education. Most American textbooks, when they address the post-Civil War period, mention slavery's abolition, Reconstruction, and its failure. But they rarely mention apprenticeship laws. They rarely note that 50,000 children were re-enslaved through courts of law. They rarely ask why this system emerged, how it functioned, and what it accomplished. This invisibility was not accidental. It was the result of deliberate historical omission. In the late 19th and 20th centuries, when American historical narratives were being constructed and standardized, there was strong incentive to minimize or overlook systems of oppression that fell outside certain conventional narratives. The dominant Reconstruction narrative became one in which Northern benevolence tried and failed to transform the South. This narrative had no space for the uncomfortable truth that the same legal system controlled by white judges in both North and South was systematically re-enslaving black children through statutes that few people understood or remembered. And so, the apprenticeship system was largely written out of American history. But now we must confront a question that the comfortable narrative of American history has avoided. If slavery was abolished by the 13th Amendment in 1865, how was it possible for 50,000 children to be re-enslaved between 1865 and 1875? The answer shatters our understanding of American freedom, because freedom was not granted, freedom was not stable, freedom was vulnerable to legal reversal. The apparatus that had enslaved millions of people did not disappear when slavery was abolished. It metamorphosed. It put on new clothes. It found new legal mechanisms. And it specifically targeted children, those who had no agency, no resources, no ability to defend themselves in court. The children in that schoolhouse photograph, they were not in school to learn. They were there because they had been processed through probate courts and declared the property of the state and its local agents. The teacher was not educating them. The teacher was guarding them. The structure around them was not an institution of learning. It was an institution of control. And the system that produced this photograph, the apprenticeship system, the machinery of courts, judges, and sheriffs that bound 50,000 children to forced labor, has never been adequately reckoned with in American law or American consciousness. The question we must now confront is this: if slavery was abolished in 1865, when did it actually end? We must speak in numbers because numbers are facts. Numbers cannot be argued with. Numbers cannot be explained away. Numbers cannot be rationalized or euphemized or hidden beneath layers of legal language. Numbers exist in ledgers and courthouse records and archives that still stand today, available to anyone willing to look at them. Between 1865 and 1875, approximately 50,000 African American children disappeared into the apprenticeship system. Not disappeared in the sense of being lost or mislaid. They were not missing persons. They were taken. They were seized. They were processed through legal machinery. With meticulous precision, they were documented, recorded, cataloged in county ledgers that have survived to the present day. But from the perspective of their families, from the perspective of the mothers and fathers who woke up one morning to discover their children gone from the only homes they had known since emancipation, they had disappeared. 50,000 specific children, 50,000 specific acts of seizure carried out under the formal authority of law, 50,000 indentures that were signed by judges, witnessed by white citizens, and recorded in court documents that remain archived in state capitals and county courthouses across the South. When we speak of 50,000, we are not speaking in abstractions or generalizations. We are speaking of a system so comprehensive, so deliberately constructed, so bureaucratically perfect, that it managed to recapture and bind to new servitude an entire generation of children whose only crime was being born black in post-emancipation America. The data itself tells us the incomprehensible scale of what was happening. In Kentucky alone, that single border state that prided itself on being more moderate than the Deep South, Christian County recorded 138 apprenticeship indentures in 1866 alone. 138 children in a single county, in a single year. Think about what that means. That means that probate court judges were sitting in Christian County, processing child seizures at a rate of more than 2 per week after week, month after month. That means white citizens were arriving at the courthouse with petitions in hand, seeking to recapture the labor of black children, and they were succeeding more than 2 times per week. This was not anomalous behavior. This was not the result of a single aggressive judge or a particularly cruel county. This was the system functioning exactly as designed. When historians examine the court records of other Kentucky counties, Fayette County, Jefferson County, Bourbon County, Madison County, the pattern repeats with devastating consistency. Hundreds of children per county every year for 10 consecutive years. The machinery was operating at full capacity. South Carolina's records are even more revealing. The state's extant court records document over 8,000 apprenticeship contracts issued between 1865 and 1870. 8,000. That is not 800. That is not 80. That is 8,000 children. 8,000 children means 8,000 families destroyed. 8,000 separate legal proceedings initiated in courtrooms across the state. 8,000 moments when a mother or father stood helpless before a court that refused to acknowledge their rights as parents, refused to hear their testimony, refused to consider their claims of fitness to raise their own children. Louisiana's records reveal a similarly catastrophic pattern. When historians have examined the apprenticeship data from Louisiana, combing through courthouse records and Freedmen's Bureau files, they have found over 4,000 documented cases of children bound in apprenticeship. But the documentation is profoundly incomplete. Many counties did not maintain legible records, or the records were deliberately destroyed, or they were simply never properly archived. The true number of apprenticeship cases in Louisiana was almost certainly far higher than the documented 4,000. Mississippi, the state that passed the first comprehensive apprenticeship statute, saw thousands of children bound in the years immediately following emancipation. Maryland, though a border state and ostensibly more sympathetic to the freedmen, saw its planter class move with striking swiftness to apprentice thousands of black children to perpetuate their economic dominance. The machinery operated in every state where the black codes existed. The machinery operated across state lines with a consistency that suggests not chaos or individual cruelty, but systematic design, deliberate, coordinated, and intentional. But these numbers, real as they are, documented as they are, conceal something equally important: resistance. The 50,000 figure represents children who were successfully bound through legal proceedings, children whose names appear in courthouse ledgers as property transferred from public guardianship to private masters. But there were thousands more who fought back. There were families who refused to accept this seizure quietly, mothers and fathers and grandparents who understood exactly what apprenticeship meant, who had lived through slavery, who had seen what labor bondage did to children, fought with the only tools available to them in a legal system designed to exclude them. They sued. They filed petitions with the Freedmen's Bureau. They testified in court despite knowing that their testimony would likely be ignored or actively discredited by white judges and juries. They gathered as communities. Some families literally placed their bodies between their children and the white officials attempting to seize them, forcing sheriffs to physically remove mothers from their children. The historical record captures some of these moments of resistance, though many more went undocumented. In South Carolina, African American families vigorously protested the apprenticeship laws and sued to get their children back. These suits often failed. Many were dismissed without hearing. Many were appealed and lost again. But they were filed. These petitions were drafted and signed. These families refused to accept the seizure of their children as inevitable or permanent. They refused to surrender to the machinery. The Freedmen's Bureau records tell us that this resistance took material form in thousands of letters and petitions. The Bureau's files are filled with desperate correspondence from mothers demanding the return of their children who had been bound out without parental consent. In Kentucky, 1866, a woman named Hannah, a freedwoman who worked as a washerwoman to support her family, petitioned the Bureau. Her letter survives in the archives, and it reads like an act of defiance against a system designed to silence her. "They have taken my boy James from me and bound him to a planter. He is only 9 years old. I can feed him. I can care for him. I have always been able to care for him. Please help me get my child back." Hannah's case was not unique. It was one of hundreds of similar letters that arrived at Bureau offices throughout the South. The Bureau's own files documented hundreds of such pleas, thousands across all states combined. But the response to these pleas was brutally inconsistent. In some cases, particularly in Maryland where federal commitment was stronger, Bureau commissioners canceled indentures they deemed fraudulent or legally defective. They challenged court proceedings. They refused to recognize apprenticeships that violated the rights of parents. These commissioners understood what was happening. They saw the system for what it was. But in other cases, particularly in states like Kentucky, where Bureau resources were thin and spread impossibly thin, where the commitment to freedmen's rights was weaker or compromised by local pressure, the commissioners simply rubber-stamped the court proceedings. They approved indentures that had been illegally obtained. They failed to investigate whether parents truly could not provide care. They looked away. The machinery was allowed to grind on. But in Maryland, something different happened. There, the Freedmen's Bureau mustered effective resistance to the apprenticeship system that went beyond individual case intervention. The Bureau began funding habeas corpus actions, legal cases designed to recover apprenticed children and restore them to their parents, and committed resources to staff a constitutional challenge to the apprenticeship law itself. A freedman named John Dennis had 2 sons seized through an apprenticeship proceeding in 1864 before the war had even ended. Dennis went first to the white planter who was claiming his sons and confronted him directly. The planter's response revealed the truth beneath the legal fiction. He told Dennis a simple, brutal statement that cut through all the bureaucratic language about protection and education. He meant to keep them and do by them as he had done by his slaves. The planter was not pretending. He was not deceiving himself about what apprenticeship meant. He understood that this system was slavery continued. He said so. Dennis heard that truth, and he understood that no negotiation was possible. Dennis then turned to the Freedmen's Bureau. He told the Bureau agents, "I can't afford a lawyer. I need help. The law has taken my children from me." The Bureau heard him. Bureau lawyers took up his case. They began to build a legal challenge that went beyond Dennis's specific situation. They pursued the case through Maryland's courts. They argued that the entire legal architecture of Maryland's apprenticeship statute was unconstitutional. They argued that it violated the 13th Amendment. They argued that it violated the basic rights of freedmen and freedwomen to raise their own children. In 1867, Maryland's Court of Appeals ruled them correct. The apprenticeship law was struck down as unconstitutional. It was an extraordinary victory. Children already bound in apprenticeship could be recovered, families could be restored. The system, for once, had been broken. But this victory in Maryland proved to be an exception, not the rule. In most states, the Bureau's capacity to help was overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the crisis. The legal resources available were minimal. The political will to fight the apprenticeship systems was inconsistent. And even where the Bureau did intervene effectively, state courts and local officials in other states found ways to circumvent federal authority or simply refused to acknowledge it. Maryland's victory stood alone. There was another form of resistance that the legal records capture far less clearly, resistance that left no paper trail, that was documented only in fragmentary accounts from Bureau officers, newspapers, and the rare oral histories that survived. Children ran. In October of 1865, a Freedmen's Bureau commissioner in New Orleans, announced that 2 black orphanages in the city would be closed. The commissioner announced that all children housed within those orphanages would be apprenticed to their former slaveholders. The announcement was made. The machinery had spoken. White planters arrived at the orphanage doors, arriving with legal paperwork in hand, arriving to claim children they had once enslaved. They arrived expecting compliance. They arrived expecting that the end of slavery meant merely a change in the paperwork, not a fundamental change in the reality of their power over black bodies. They arrived expecting that they could recapture the labor of children who had been born into their ownership. But they discovered something they did not expect. By the time they arrived at the orphanage, by the time they came to collect their newly apprenticed workers, approximately half of the children had already fled. They had heard what was coming. They had understood what apprenticeship meant. They had chosen flight and danger and the unknown over the certainty of re-enslavement. A newspaper of the period documented this extraordinary act of defiance with a single sentence that captures the entire moral universe of these children. Even the children would rather die than be bound again by any chains. These were children. Most were under the age of 10. Some were as young as 4 or 5 years old. They had been born into slavery. They had experienced the tail end of slavery, if not slavery itself. They remembered what bondage meant. They had been in that orphanage. They had heard the plans. They had understood the reality. And rather than submit to a new legal form of that bondage, they ran. Across Louisiana, across Kentucky, across all the southern states, documented cases exist of apprenticed children who escaped their masters. Some were never recaptured. Some managed to flee to northern cities where they could lose themselves in urban anonymity. Some died in the attempt. Some drowned trying to cross rivers to freedom. The point is that the resistance was not confined to families suing in courtrooms or freedmen petitioning federal bureaus. It was embodied in the bodies of children who voted with their feet, who understood that legal systems and documents and judicial signatures ultimately mattered less than the human capacity for refusal. And yet, despite this resistance, despite mothers like Hannah petitioning, despite Dennis fighting in courts, despite children running into the darkness, the system did not break. The apparatus had been constructed precisely to withstand legal challenges, to absorb resistance, to channel defiance through multiple institutional layers until defiance was neutralized. When a bureau officer in Maryland canceled an indenture, when federal power reasserted itself, the white master could appeal to the state court. When a bureau officer in Kentucky refused to process an apprenticeship application, the master could bypass the federal agency entirely and go directly to the county probate judge, who would process the seizure without hesitation. The system had multiple levers. When one was pulled by a sympathetic federal official, another could be pulled by a state or local official to achieve the same result. Federal law could not protect children whose state courts refused to acknowledge federal authority. Children could flee, but most were ultimately recaptured by sheriffs armed with legal warrants and authorized to use force. Families could sue, but most lacked the resources to prosecute a legal case, lacked the money to hire attorneys, lacked the ability to appeal an adverse ruling. The architecture of power had been constructed to be resilient, redundant, and nearly impossible to dismantle through the very legal mechanisms that had created it. The true scale of what this system accomplished lies not only in the 50,000 documented cases, but in what remains invisible, what will never be known. This 50,000 figure represents children who appear in courthouse ledgers, children whose apprenticeships were formally recorded in official documents that survived the decades. But behind this documentation lies a far darker and larger reality. How many more children were apprenticed through informal arrangements without the meticulous documentation that state courts required? How many informal agreements existed between black families, desperate families trying to negotiate survival, and white employers that resembled apprenticeship in everything but name? How many white planters simply took children onto their farms without any legal proceeding at all, simply because they could? Simply because the law would not and could not protect the children? How many children died under this system and were simply buried in unmarked graves? The 50,000 represents a documented floor, a minimum. The actual number of children who experienced this system was certainly much larger. Children seized through quiet arrangements that left no paper trail. Children taken without any pretense of legality. children working in fields and shops and kitchens, their labor extracted by men and women who believed they still owned them, who had never truly accepted that slavery had ended. The system succeeded in its primary objective, to solve the South's labor problem by recapturing those who had been legally freed, but whose freedom was not meant to be substantive, was not meant to be real, was not meant to threaten the racial and economic hierarchy that had defined the South for centuries. The system succeeded. The children disappeared into work. The families were separated. The mechanism of enslavement was preserved, reconstructed. The apprenticeship system was not meant to last forever. It could not last forever. Federal soldiers still occupied the South. Northern Republicans still controlled Congress. The 13th Amendment was law. And so, the system did what all systems of oppression do when they become indefensible. It adapted. It transformed. It preserved the mechanism while changing the legal language. And so began a series of metamorphoses, each one shedding the skin of the previous system while maintaining the essential function. The children in that schoolhouse photograph would grow up. Their children would face different systems, different statutes, different justifications, but they would face the same machinery. They would experience the same re-enslavement. The first and most brutal transformation came almost immediately. As Reconstruction collapsed, as federal troops withdrew, as Northern Republicans lost political control of the South, as white Democrats reasserted dominance, new statutes began to appear in state legislatures. They bore different names. They were justified through different legal theories. But their function was identical: to bind African American bodies to contracts that could not be broken, to extract labor without compensation, to ensure that legal freedom meant nothing in practical terms. The most notorious of these mechanisms was something called the convict leasing system. Between 1871 and 1900, the convict leasing system became the primary mechanism through which the South re-enslaved thousands of African Americans. Here is how it worked. A black person, often a child or young adult, was arrested for a crime. Sometimes it was a real crime. More often, it was not. The crime could be as minor as violating a curfew, appearing to be unemployed, or even simply existing without white permission. Sometimes the crime was entirely fabricated. A black person was arrested on false charges designed to ensnare them. The criminal justice system was deliberately and explicitly designed to funnel black people into the machinery. And once arrested, the system moved with terrifying efficiency. The black person would be convicted. Conviction rates were extraordinarily high because black defendants had no meaningful legal representation, no ability to defend themselves in courtrooms filled with white jurors who had no interest in justice, presided over by judges who were themselves committed to racial hierarchy. Upon conviction, the sentence was typically imprisonment. But here is where the mechanism becomes visible. The state did not actually plan to hold these prisoners in state penitentiaries. Instead, under the terms of Section 2 of the 13th Amendment, which permitted slavery as a punishment for crime, the state would lease these prisoners to private companies, railroad companies, mining companies, timber operations, plantation owners. The prisoners were then transported to these sites and forced to work without compensation, without legal protection, under conditions identical to or worse than slavery. They were beaten, they were starved, they died at extraordinary rates. Between 1871 and 1900, tens of thousands of African Americans, the majority of them between ages 16 and 30, were processed through the convict leasing system. In Tennessee alone, over 20,000 African Americans passed through convict leasing in the decades following Reconstruction. In Alabama, the numbers were even higher. In Mississippi, Georgia, Louisiana, and every other former Confederate state, tens of thousands of black people were re-enslaved through criminal convictions that trapped them in a machinery of exploitation. This was not a simple continuation of the apprenticeship system, but it was the same mechanism wearing new clothes. The apprenticeship system had relied on family courts and the legal fiction of orphan status to capture children and justify their seizure. The convict leasing system relied on criminal courts and the legal fiction of crime to capture adults and older children. But both operated according to identical logic. Both specifically targeted black people. Both extracted labor without compensation. Both were publicly defended as legal and proper and justified. Both were designed to neutralize freedom, to transform a legal status into something with no material substance, and both demonstrated a crucial truth. What the South truly intended to preserve was not any particular legal mechanism, but rather the fundamental structure. The structure was this: black people remained subordinate to white people. Black labor could be expropriated. Black freedom existed only on paper, and that structure would be preserved through whatever legal means were necessary. But convict leasing was only one mechanism. Simultaneously across the South, other systems were emerging. Vagrancy laws appeared, laws that criminalized black unemployment or black mobility. These laws declared that any black person found to be without employment could be arrested and fined. If they could not pay the fine, they could be arrested again, convicted again, and sentenced again, this time to convict leasing or debt peonage. In this way, the simple state of being unemployed became a criminal offense that could result in re-enslavement. Enticement laws emerged in state after state. These laws made it a crime for one employer to recruit workers already under contract to a different employer. The effect was to bind black workers to specific employers, to prevent them from negotiating for better wages or better conditions, to lock them into permanent relationships of subordination and powerlessness. Contract enforcement laws strengthened the power of employers to hold workers to labor agreements that had been signed under duress or in conditions of desperation. Anti-enticement laws prevented black workers from seeking opportunities with new employers or from escaping abusive situations. The effect of all these laws was a system of labor control that recreated, through civil and criminal statutes rather than explicit slavery statutes, the fundamental reality of slavery. Black people could not freely choose their employers. Black people could not freely move. Black people could not freely bargain for their labor. They were bound. The freedom that the 13th Amendment promised had been translated into a legal status with no practical meaning. The most ingenious mechanism, however, the most brilliant and most durable one, was something far simpler and far more effective: sharecropping. Sharecropping was never explicitly designed as a system of re-enslavement. It emerged organically from the chaos of Reconstruction, from the fact that white planters had lost labor they depended on, while black people were desperately seeking survival and opportunity. From these competing needs, something emerged that looked on paper like a form of partnership. In practice, it functioned as slavery. Here is how it operated. A freed person, or the descendant of a freed person, would be given access to land in exchange for a share of the crops produced. A planter would provide the land. He would provide the seeds. He would provide the tools. The sharecropper would provide the labor. At the end of the harvest, the two parties would supposedly settle accounts. The profits would be divided. The sharecropper would receive his share. But this is where the system revealed its true nature. Because the sharecropper owned nothing, he was dependent on the landlord or merchant for everything. Seeds had to be purchased on credit from the plantation store. Not from other suppliers, only from the plantation store, at prices far above market rates. Tools had to be rented at inflated costs. Food to sustain the family during the growing season had to be purchased on credit from the store. Clothing, medicine, everything. By the end of the growing season, before the harvest was even gathered, the sharecropper owed more money than he could possibly earn. Then came the reckoning. The crop was harvested. It was weighed and valued, but the landowner did the weighing, the merchant did the calculating. The sharecropper had no independent verification. Often, he could not read. Often, he was deliberately deceived. Prices were manipulated. Weights were falsified. Interest rates, often 20%, 30%, 40%, or higher, were applied to the debts. By the end of the transaction, the sharecropper had earned money, but owed more money than he had earned. He entered the next year deeper in debt than when he started. This continued year after year, decade after decade. For 70 years, sharecropping locked entire families, across multiple generations, into perpetual debt and perpetual labor. It was so effective that it became the primary labor system of the South. It created what historians have called a new slavery, a system that looked different from chattel slavery on its surface, that was defended through the language of free labor and voluntary contract, but that functioned identically in practice. Black people were bound to the land. Black people were prevented from leaving. Black people had no means of escape except to abandon everything they had built and flee to the north. The sharecropper system was slavery disguised as commerce. And these mechanisms, convict leasing, vagrancy laws, enticement laws, contract enforcement laws, sharecropping, were not coincidental developments. They were not accidents of history. They were deliberately designed alternatives to the explicit apprenticeship system that had become politically untenable. They were the evolution of a unified system designed to achieve the same outcome through different legal forms. A system that could adapt, a system that could preserve itself by changing its language. And as Northern Republican control faded, as federal protection withdrew, as white Democrats reasserted political dominance, these mechanisms became progressively more explicit. The language became progressively cruder. The targeting of black people became progressively undisguised. By the 1890s and into the 20th century, all these mechanisms had been codified and formalized into what became known as the Jim Crow system, an explicit, comprehensive legal architecture dedicated to racial segregation and racial subordination on every level of life. Jim Crow laws mandated segregation in every aspect of life. They prohibited interracial marriage. They required separate facilities for black and white people, separate schools, separate entrances, separate seating areas. They prevented black people from voting through literacy tests that black people would be guaranteed to fail, grandfather clauses that exempted only the descendants of people who had voted before 1867, poll taxes that black people could not afford. They criminalized ordinary acts of black life. They created a comprehensive legal system designed to make white people feel safe in their superiority and to prevent black people from ever accumulating power or property or the means to resist. But Jim Crow laws did not emerge from a vacuum. They were not spontaneous creations. They were the legal formalization and culmination of mechanisms that had been tested, refined, and proven effective over 30 years. Convict leasing had taught white Southerners how to use the criminal justice system to re-enslave people. Vagrancy laws and enticement laws and sharecropping had taught them how to use civil and economic law to control black mobility and black labor. Jim Crow simply extended and formalized these mechanisms into a comprehensive legal system. It took the machinery that had been operating in shadows and brought it into the light. It made re-enslavement explicit and systematic and legal. And all of this, every mechanism, every statute, every court proceeding, emerged from the ashes of the apprenticeship system. All of this was built on the foundation of the 50,000 children who had been seized, bound, and exploited between 1865 and 1875. All of this was the mechanism preserved. The essential architecture of racial subordination and labor exploitation, reconstructed through different legal forms, adapted to changing political circumstances, but always maintaining the same fundamental function. The children in that schoolhouse photograph had been processed through the apprenticeship system. Their children would be processed through convict leasing. Their grandchildren would be processed through sharecropping. Their great-grandchildren would be processed through Jim Crow. The machinery did not stop. It transformed, it learned, it adapted, and it preserved itself across generations by discovering new legal languages, new justifications, new mechanisms to achieve the same essential outcome: the extraction of black labor, the prevention of black mobility, the maintenance of white racial and economic dominance. The system was never about apprenticeship in any true sense. It was never about convict leasing or sharecropping or Jim Crow taken individually. It was about a single, unified mechanism operating across 150 years, the mechanism of racial control, of labor extraction, of hierarchy preservation. That mechanism seized 50,000 children between 1865 and 1875. But it did not end in 1875. It transformed, it adapted, it became convict leasing, it became Jim Crow. It became the system that would dominate the South for the next 100 years, a system that would not formally end until the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and that in many ways has not truly ended even today. The children of the apprenticeship system grew up. They had children. Those children had children. For 150 years, a continuous mechanism of extraction and subordination has been operating, preserving itself, changing its legal names, changing its visible form, but never changing its essential function. This mechanism was not a bug in American freedom. It was not an aberration or an exception to be explained away. It was the central architecture of American racial hierarchy. It remains the central question of American history. What happened to those 50,000 children? The answer is not that they recovered and moved forward. The answer is not that the system ended. The answer is that the system is still here. It has simply learned to hide itself behind new language. The story of the apprenticeship system is not a closed chapter. It is not a tale of ancient cruelty resolved by progress and forgotten by modernity. The mechanism that began with the seizure of 50,000 black children did not die in 1875. It did not end with the Civil Rights Act of 1964. It learned to adapt. It changed its language. It updated its mechanisms and found new spaces to hide, new statutes to repackage the old bargain, and new faces to bear the scars. If the children in the schoolhouse photograph had lived to see the year 2025, they would find the line of descent unbroken. They would recognize the mechanism immediately. The system survived every attempt at reform, every effort at exposure, every promise of justice. The modern era is filled with stories that echo the past with startling clarity. The language is different. The institutions are more sophisticated. The rhetoric of freedom is louder. Yet the fundamental structure remains unchanged. In 2025, slavery is technically illegal in every country on Earth. But according to the International Labor Organization and the United Nations, nearly 50 million people live under conditions that the UN explicitly calls modern slavery. In the United States alone, according to multiple studies, an estimated 400,000 people are held in conditions of forced labor, not counted, not visible, but present, on farms, in garment factories, in private homes, in restaurants and construction sites. The overwhelming majority are immigrants, Latin American farm workers lured by false promises of work visas and good wages, domestic workers from the Philippines and Africa working without pay in wealthy suburban homes, children trafficked across state lines for agricultural labor, and refugees who fled violence only to find themselves trapped in another form of bondage. Their stories rarely make headlines. The system excels at making these people invisible, just as it did with 50,000 children 150 years ago. Consider the case documented by federal investigators. In 2021, federal agents uncovered what they called Operation Onion, a trafficking network in South Georgia that had enslaved hundreds of Mexican and Central American agricultural workers. The workers were forced to dig onions by hand in fields surrounded by electrified fences. They worked under the threat of guns. The contractors paid them 20 cents per bucket, an impossibly low rate for brutal labor. They were housed in labor camps described by investigators as resembling concentration camps. Overcrowded, unsanitary, no access to clean water or food. Workers who tried to leave were threatened with deportation. Those who became sick were left to suffer. Several workers died. Federal prosecutors called it what it was: modern slavery. But this was not an isolated incident. Operation Onion was simply the one case that was exposed, prosecuted, and made public. How many other fields in Georgia, Alabama, Florida, and across the agricultural belt hold people under similar conditions? The system specializes in remaining hidden. But perhaps the most chilling and direct continuity is found not on shadowed farms or in secret warehouses, but in the open heart of the American justice system. The criminal justice system, originally engineered during Reconstruction to perpetuate convict leasing, remains a mechanism built for racial control. The statistics are undeniable. Black Americans comprise 13% of the U.S. population, yet account for nearly 40% of the incarcerated population. Black men are incarcerated at a rate more than 5 times higher than white men. And here's the crucial detail. The 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery except as a punishment for crime, remains a living wound. In 2025, hundreds of thousands of Americans are forced to work in prisons for compensation so minimal it amounts to theft. They sew uniforms for state contracts. They pick crops that feed prisons and schools. They process beef for the nation's school lunch program. They scrub toilets and clean floors. All of this under threat of solitary confinement, which is to say torture, for refusing orders. In Texas, in Florida, in Georgia, private prison contracts and food processing partnerships have created economic incentives that mirror the incentive structure of old convict leasing. Stories of abuse, neglect, and death proliferate in court records and local reports. They track eerily close to the testimonies of children bound under apprenticeship 150 years ago. Out in the free world, beyond prison walls, the system survives through an architecture of debt and deception. For Black and immigrant families, the mechanisms of extraction have simply put on the attire of credit, wage theft, predatory lending, and housing discrimination. Sharecropping is gone in name, but its logic persists everywhere. In southern chicken processing plants, many of them operating in the exact regions that once depended on sharecropping, line workers, many of them undocumented or refugee workers from Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador, report threats, illegal wage deductions, and compensation so low that debts pile up faster than any worker can pay them down. Workers are charged for the uniforms they wear. They are charged for the hand tools they use. They are charged for knives and sanitizing equipment. Deductions are made for bathroom breaks. Overtime is not compensated. By the end of the pay period, workers owe money. By the end of the year, families are trapped in cycles of debt that mirror sharecropping exactly. They cannot leave because they owe money. They owe money because they stayed. In urban communities, payday lenders and predatory mortgage companies replicate old cycles of dependency, rebranding racial exploitation as the market and personal responsibility. A missed rent payment, a medical bill, a brief period of illness, and a family can be separated by child protective services, with children sent into foster care systems haunted by trafficking scandals and fatality rates that far exceed those of white households. The mechanism of family separation, perfected under apprenticeship law, has simply been relabeled as family preservation and child protection. Technology, too, has become an instrument of invisible bondage in 2025. Digital tracking, algorithmic policing, and facial recognition. Systems amplify older patterns of control and discrimination. Black neighborhoods are blanketed by surveillance cameras and police presence. Automated bail systems, built on flawed data that reflects historical discrimination, keep the poor, and especially minorities, locked in jail for minor infractions. DNA is sampled and warehoused without consent, building new digital ledgers of control that will follow individuals across their lives. In rural farming communities, agricultural workers are fitted with GPS ankle bracelets that track their movement. Employers can threaten deportation or rearrest through a simple phone call. The patrolling of freedom is more sophisticated than ever, less visible, less crude, but just as relentless and just as effective. Even in places that ostensibly represent justice and reform, in public schools, hospitals, and government offices, the shadow of the mechanism persists like a genetic trait that cannot be eliminated. Zero-tolerance discipline policies in public schools disproportionately target Black children, feeding them directly into what scholars call the school-to-prison pipeline. Children as young as 6 are suspended, expelled, or arrested for minor rule infractions or behavioral issues. Their names enter state databases not as apprentices, as they would have been 150 years ago, but as juvenile offenders, truancy risks, wards of the state. The labels change, the function remains identical. The early identification, marking, and sorting of children based on race, followed by processing through systems of control. In hospitals, the shadow persists in medical neglect. Black mothers die in childbirth at 3 times the rate of white mothers. Black infants die at nearly 3 times the rate of white infants. Many of these disparities can be traced to subtle but systemic legacies. Generational malnutrition resulting from sharecropping and poverty, chronic stress resulting from centuries of racial trauma, no access to generational wealth, inadequate prenatal care. The machine still feeds, the system still extracts. And yet, just as before, resistance continues. In 2020, after the death of George Floyd at the hands of police, 26 million Americans participated in demonstrations against racial injustice, the largest social protest movement in U.S. history. Black Lives Matter, labor organizers, and allied movements returned national attention to old realities: mass incarceration, police violence, the new Jim Crow, and economic apartheid. Across the nation, activists and families are fighting to dismantle the infrastructure of racial extraction. They demand the abolition of forced prison labor. They demand an end to predatory lending and exploitation in agricultural labor. They demand reparations for families destroyed by redlining and child removal. They demand accountability from the policing system that was, from its inception, designed for racial control and labor discipline. They are, in their own way, continuing the fight that Hannah and John Dennis and 50,000 apprentice children began 150 years ago. They are saying, no, we will not accept this. We will name the mechanism, we will expose it, and we will dismantle it. But resistance and awareness have never been enough. The system adapts, institutions shapeshift, metrics improve, language softens. Policies are reformed at the margins while the fundamental architecture of extraction remains intact. The children who once looked into the lens of a schoolhouse camera, whose names were written in court ledgers, whose labor was stolen, and whose families were destroyed, their descendants are still living with the consequences in 2025. They live in neighborhoods marked by disinvestment. They attend schools funded by property taxes, creating educational apartheid. They are more likely to be incarcerated, to die in childbirth, to live in poverty, to be denied credit, to be refused housing. The generational wealth that white families accumulated through slavery and sharecropping remains. The generational debt that black families incurred through the same systems persists. If the ghosts of those children could speak, they would not marvel at how much has changed. They would recognize, with a terrible clarity, how much remains the same. Because the mechanism never truly died. It is still here. It is still operating. It has simply learned to hide itself behind new language, new names for the same function, new justifications for the same extraction, new legal frameworks for the same subordination. And until that mechanism is named, exposed, dismantled completely and irreversibly, the story of those 50,000 children is not history. It is prologue. It is the opening chapter of a story that continues to unfold in factories, fields, prisons, and courts across America in the year 2025. The children in that photograph are still waiting for justice, and the system that enslaved them is still waiting to be named.